you know. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for coming. I know that the topic, particularly the suicide prevention part, is a tough topic. And so I want you to all really give yourself a good boost for coming to talk about a tough topic tonight. But also, it's a hopeful thing that we can do together to prevent youth suicide and to promote youth mental health. My name is Dawn Alcott, and I'm the Director of Hopkinton Youth and Family Services. And I welcome you here tonight in the company of just really wonderful presenters. Jim McCauley is from Riverside Trauma Center. You'll see in your packet, everybody's bios are here, but Jim is the Associate Director of the Riverside Trauma Center. And he does these talks all over the state, and I think he'll tell you how often he's been doing these talks. And then we have Dr. Naja Lopez-Riley, and she is the director of Interface, which is, there's a card here about Interface, but I'm going to walk you through your packet later. But you can read about all the many roles that Naja has had at William James College and beyond. She's going to be speaking to you tonight about what you can do as family members for your loved ones who are struggling at home. And then we have Carla Burley from the Hopkinton Public Schools. She is she's filling a new role as the Social Emotional Learning Director. And so she's going to share with you as a resource about what she plans to do and what social emotional learning is and what the school district is doing on that end. And then I'll rejoin and kind of share with you a little bit about what's coming in the community and, you know, some low-hanging fruit that you can do right away to both boost mental health and prevent youth suicide in the community. So without further ado, I don't want to take a lot of your time with technical things. I'll introduce you to Jim, and he'll be sharing with you first.
Thank you, and thanks to all of you for coming out, and here we are talking about such a hard topic on a beautiful night. It feels like at a better time we would all be outside playing and just going for walks and that kind of thing, and here we are inside now. And I just want to tell you a little bit about Riverside Trauma Center. We are a resource for your community. We've been involved for a number of years with Hopkinton. When a critical incident happens, and by that I mean when something bad happens in a school, workplace, or a community, we go in and provide mental health support. So sometimes that's large-scale events like hurricanes, tornadoes. We were very active after the Boston Marathon bombings. So we do those large-scale events, but probably 70 to 80% of what we do is we respond after there's been a sudden unexpected death in a community, and more often than not, that's a suicide death. And for that reason, we've become very passionate about suicide prevention. So any opportunity that we have to talk to schools, to teachers, to mental health clinicians, we do a lot of training for mental health clinicians around suicide assessment and intervention. But a big thing that I always welcome the opportunity is to talk to a group of parents. And I think because we need you to be part of our suicide prevention activities. I think you are probably the key factor here in helping us keep kids safe. I think there's a lot of emphasis on what schools are doing and what schools should be doing. In the U.S., we know that schools are the #1 mental health resource that we have for children under the age of 18, and yet they're really not prepared to do that. They're not funded to do that. And so for that reason, we really want to make sure that the community is doing their part, and that parents are sort of know and have the tools to support their kids. And Dr. Riley is going to talk to you a little bit more about that. But I also wanted to tell you, too, just that everybody has been reading the news and knows what's going on with COVID these last couple of years. And what's happening in Hopkinton is pretty universal throughout the country, certainly in Massachusetts. One of the things, I know most of you are familiar with the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and 2 years ago, I think it was 2019, basically the survey said that about 30% of high school students reported feeling so sad or hopeless for a 2-week period or longer that they stopped doing their usual activities. Well, that's an early sign of depression. 30%. 2 years ago, about 18% of high school students said that they had thought about suicide, that they had seriously considered suicide. Again, staggering numbers. And about 7% report that they made a suicide attempt. Again, pretty staggering numbers, I think. About 2 to 3% of those students who made a suicide attempt ended up getting medical care for that. But again, if you have a high school with 1,000 students, right, then that's 20 to 30 students a year that make a suicide attempt requiring medical attention. Unfortunately, we have recent data from the Center for Disease Control, and the numbers have significantly increased, so that now, instead of 30% of students reporting that they're depressed, we have about 44% of students saying that they're depressed or feeling hopeless. About 20% reporting suicidal ideation, and about 10% report that they've made a suicide attempt. So you can see these are significant numbers that are cause for concern for all of us. In the last 2 years, we've seen about a 51% increase in the number of teenage girls ending up in the emergency room for suicide attempts and suicidal behaviors. So again, pretty significant numbers. And for that reason, I'm hoping that we can sort of arm you with information about how you can support your children. There's a lot of myths about suicide. I want to address some of those, but I want to tell you just for our point, or at the trauma center, our sort of working definition of suicide is that it's an attempt to escape intense pain and hopelessness. So oftentimes people who make a suicide attempt tell us they didn't really want to die, they just wanted to escape the pain. They just couldn't tolerate the pain. But again, it's always the combination of pain and hopelessness. Now, if I ask you, if I say to you, you tell me that you're in a lot of pain, but you think it's going to go away in 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, you're not going to think about suicide. But if you think that pain is never going to go away, then that's when the thoughts of suicide come into your head. Now, that's adults. So we're talking about 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. And here's one of the problems with teenagers. We think of them as being so impulsive, but really their developmental sense of this idea of hopelessness is a much shorter time frame. When they talk about a time frame for hopelessness, they're talking about 2 weeks, maybe 2 months. So that smaller time frame, I think, is really what's so worrisome for young people. Suicide is always complicated. sometimes you will hear people say that so-and-so, that this particular child or this young man or this young woman died from suicide because of academic stress or because of a bad breakup in a relationship. And there's rarely one narrative. It's almost always what we kind of talk about as the perfect storm, right? There's multiple variables coming together. And always we see this underlying vulnerability. And for young people, the underlying vulnerability is probably number one, a history of trauma, childhood trauma, neglect, abuse, certainly are most prominent kinds of trauma that young people experience. But also a history of depression or anxiety. I think those of us in mental health underrated the role of anxiety in suicide for way too long. And I think it's much more of a factor than we've realized. And then the other thing with young people is young people struggling with sexual identity, sexual gender issues. And it's not because of their identity, it's because of their perception of how they're treated by family, friends, in the school community, and at large. So even some of the legislation that we see happening across the country now, the sort of don't say gay legislation, even though that may be in other states, it has a dramatic impact even on teenagers here in Massachusetts, which feels more like a more protected state, I think, to most people, but it still has a dramatic impact on their self-esteem. So the underlying vulnerability is there. And also, when you talk to young people that are thinking about suicide, what they often tell you is that they feel like a burden. They feel like a burden and they don't feel like they're connected to other people. And the burdensomeness is issue because sometimes you will hear people say, after somebody dies by suicide, you will hear people say, oh, what a selfish thing to do. But from the person who's in a suicidal crisis, their feeling is that their friends and family will be better off if they're out of the picture. Now, of course, that's a distorted perception, but that's the way they feel. So that young people getting into trouble, getting suspended from school or getting arrested or whatever it is, causing family issues, they often feel like they'd be doing their family basically a service by killing themselves. So again, very distorted perception, but one that you want to address. Suicide risk is dynamic, and what I mean by that is there's almost like a roller coaster effect. I think sometimes people think somebody is suicidal, they're going to stay that way, they've been that way for days, weeks, months, longer. But for most people, about over 50% of people, their suicide thinking, their ideation, really ebbs and flows throughout even a day. So that it's not uncommon at all for a young person at 8 o'clock in the morning to feel acutely suicidal, not be sure how they can get through the day. By noon, they're not thinking about it at all. And then by 5 o'clock in the evening, it's back on their radar. They're thinking about it again. So that suicidal risk is really quite almost like a roller coaster effect that we see, which makes it much harder to intervene and to know what to do when somebody is struggling. Less than 50% of people who die by suicide have seen a counselor. And so what that means is that we all have to be what we call gatekeepers. That's a public health prevention concept, that we want people to sort of know what the risk factors are, what the warning signs are, and be able to know what to do, know what to say, and not ignore warning signs that we might see for anybody who's struggling. So, some of those things they're much harder to pinpoint with adolescents, but changes in sleeping habits and eating habits, becoming more irritable, talking about feeling hopeless, sort of veiled threats about, I can't do this anymore, I can't take this anymore, all my problems are going to be solved by next week, when you know that that can't possibly be the case. So listening for those cues and not being afraid to ask directly about suicide when you hear that. But being a good listener, I think, is really the key. People who are thinking about suicide at any age, young people, adolescents, adults, elderly, what they tell us over and over again is they don't necessarily want somebody to problem solve with them. They just want somebody to listen to them and validate their concerns. That's really the key thing, that active listening piece. So I think that's sort of a good thing for all of us to remember when we're trying to support somebody. But know what your resources are. We're going to talk about that. And don't be afraid to ask your child to. Don't assume that your child is okay. Over 50% of parents of adolescents that are struggling with suicidal ideation don't know that their child is struggling. So that's why we say, ask. So what I would say is, go home, when you go home tonight or tomorrow, find a good place, a good time to have that conversation with your child, just about how they're doing. You start big, from a big perspective, just like I went to this parent forum last night and people were talking about suicide, and I'm just kind of wondering what you're hearing in the larger school community. What are your friends saying? And then, how about you? Sort of, where are you with this? And would you come to me if you were upset? If you didn't know what to do, you were scared, you didn't know who to turn to, would you come to me? And a lot of times kids will say no, and the reason that they say no is because they don't want to be a burden, remember? And they'll say, you know what, my mom, she's in human resources at her job, and they're in the middle of layoffs right now. She's really stressed. I don't want to burden her. So if that's the case too, then ask, who are the adults in your life that you can talk to? And oftentimes they'll say, and again, this is why we like everybody in the community, they'll say, well, my soccer coach, I feel like I could talk to her, or my math teacher, I feel like I could talk to her. They'll name people and those trusted adults. We want every student to have a trusted adult in school and a trusted adult outside of school. And if they have that, then I think we're going to be in pretty good shape. I'm going to let Dr. Riley talk now, and talk a little bit more about the role of parents. And thank you for listening. And thank you so much for coming out tonight.
And as Jim takes his seat and Najee gets up, you have note cards. You can be writing questions on note cards, and then you can be passing them in. And there's Colleen from Youth and Family Services, Cassandra, and Lauren. And they'll take those from you. If you need a pen, just put your hand up, and we've got pens that we can get to you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. As Jim and Dawn have said, we are so grateful to be here with you today and to be able to have this important conversation. As Jim was mentioning, suicide prevention really does take a community. We need a community where we can have open communication, where there can be resources at hand, and we know that parents and caregivers are, of course, essential members of that community. So I'd like to take a little bit of time today to talk about, what do we do once a child is either identified as having some mental health concerns, or you're worried that that is going on. As a parent with 2 boys, I definitely can understand some of these questions. I've had them myself. I've had to have some of these difficult conversations with my boys too. And the good news is that the first time feels like the scariest ever, and you sort of, cringe a little bit, but every time you ask after, it gets easier and easier. You're building a common language. It doesn't feel as hard, and you're building multiple opportunities to be able to have these conversations over time. So I want to invite you to think about some of these things that we're going to discuss today. Some of them might feel like, oh yeah, that really resonates for me. Some of them might not, so I invite you to take what you feel, would be a good fit for you and your family. I know that some of the questions that often come up are, how far do I push, right? Like, how do I know if it's okay to set some limits or not set some limits, or will I be making things worse if I say something? Or sometimes when you see kids getting better, right, and they feel like they're getting back on track, and then they take a little backslide, and you said, well, but what happened? I thought you were getting better, right? That sense of frustration or worry or panic about the future. So all of these questions are normal. They're natural to experience. And I find that there's sort of 3 key buckets that always help to ground me, and certainly are helpful in grounding us through what is a longer term road, right? So one of them is going back to what you know. What I mean by that is that often we feel like, oh boy, we have to develop all sorts of new skills all of a sudden, or we have to really, figure out all these new ways of being because that's the only thing that will work. But actually going back to what you know, and what feels comfortable and what has worked in the past can be an important source of grounding. So we'll talk about what that could be. The other thing is a focus on co-regulation. And what I mean by that is when our kids are struggling, the characteristic of a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder is that they're dysregulated, right? They're having a hard time regulating positive mood and negative mood as well. And so they need some external regulation. So we can offer that for them. But in order for us to be able to do that, we need to be regulated as well. So paying attention to our own emotions, being able to practice the skills together with kids can be incredibly helpful. And the last thing is to practice skills more as a routine and as a family, as part of an ongoing situation, rather than thinking that these skills are only when things are acute. When we talk about prevention, when we discuss the concept of trying to target things early, we know that the earlier that we approach treatment, the earlier that we approach symptoms when they first come up, the better the long-term outcomes. So encouraging you to really identify symptoms early, but also to continue practicing skills even when things seem to be on a really good trend. So one of the things that can be really helpful is sort of taking a step back and reflecting, how do we typically talk about emotions in our home, right? Are we sending the messages that it's okay to talk about all kinds of emotions or only some kinds of emotion? I want to reference back what Jim was saying, that sometimes when kids feel like they're a burden, they don't want to share the harder emotions, right? When they're feeling really sad, when they're feeling hopeless. And so it's important to think back about, how are we as a family, just in general, talking about emotions? And how can we give the permission to say, whatever's coming up for you, whether it feels like it's a good talk, a hard talk, a challenging talk, whatever it is, we're here and we can talk about that. I have to put my glasses on, this is too small. What patterns do we get stuck in as a family when things come up? Do we get frustrated and angry when we don't know what's going on and we're trying to figure something out? Do we rush to problem solving? And do we try to do that too quickly before we really stop and sort of listen, be good active listeners like Jim was talking about? So really stepping back for a moment and saying, where are we starting? And what are some of the patterns that we might need to change to create the conditions for better communication? As part of that, I would really encourage you to think about what is your own coping style, right? What do you do when you get really stressed? I know that when my son comes to me and he tells me that something's stressing him out, I'm already thinking like plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, and like not only tomorrow, but 5 years down the road, right? If he doesn't go to driving lessons, then he's never gonna get a license, he's not gonna get a job, he's gonna live with me forever, right? Like I spiral down. And I have to know that about myself, that I rush to problem solve, and I also need to know what are some of my triggers that trigger my own anxiety. So what do I need to do? Who do I need to reach out to in order to be at a place where I can say, all right, let's talk about that driver instructor. What didn't feel so great about that? And tell me more about that, right? An important thing that Jim mentioned that I want to really reiterate is sometimes kids might not want to come to you first, or they might be a little hesitant. Sometimes that can feel like, ouch, what, you don't want to come to me first? But in this kind of situation, it's really helpful to have your own community to think about who can you talk to, who can be a good active listener for you, and who could you reach out to maybe have a little different spin or way of asking questions so your child has more than one person that he or she can talk to. And then what do you know about your child, right? What is his or her coping skill? If you're the kind of person who likes to give a lot of information, right? You're problem solving, you like to give a lot of information, but your child's like, just tell me like when it's time for me to know. I don't want to have too much advanced information. You want to know that about him or her, right? So you find a better time, a time where he or she is more receptive to the conversation. What soothes your child? I find that it's really important to think about, we do a lot of problem solving when we're worried about emotional health because we're worried about consequences, but going back to what you know can also be really soothing in the moment. Do they like to go for a walk? Do they like to watch movies? Can you just kind of sit and be a good active listener? Or maybe not even talk at all, but having that calming presence can be very helpful. So that's what I mean by going back to what you know and sort of using those skills. The other piece about this that is really important is for us to think about how can we set good conditions for talking about tough situations. One of the things I would say is to be really intentional about language. I will confess, I have caught myself several times saying, "What is wrong with you?" And then I stop and I think, nope. So I have been trying to be very mindful about saying, what happened to you, right? That takes away from the responsibility of the child. It takes away from that sense of judgment that they're already feeling very much internally themselves. And it's more about what happened. Other ways to be really intentional with language is to use I statements. And to share what you're noticing, right? So I am noticing this, or I feel this, rather than interpreting for the kids or using terms that might feel diagnostic, like, oh, you know, your anxiety is really getting in the way. Instead, you might want to say something like, I noticed that it's been hard to get up and do this. Tell me more about that. One of the things that I would also say is we tend to talk or refer to these conversations as challenging or difficult conversations. And I would want to reframe that again with that intentionality as courageous conversations. We really want kids to feel like they're doing the right thing when they're telling us, and it shouldn't be about it being difficult or challenging or shameful. It should really be about them being courageous and sharing what they're feeling. Another thing is to be present. There's such a temptation to listen with one ear and then the other part of your brain is already thinking about solutions or what you will do. Kids are really good at calling us out when we're only sort of half paying attention. So I would say, you know, put phones down, resist the urge to problem solve, and really make good eye contact. And just say, tell me more. Tell me more is such an inviting piece, and using curiosity. Things like, what would be helpful for me to do right now? Do you want me to just listen? Because I can do that. Do you want me to offer some solutions? Again, it's about setting the conditions in such a way that kids will not feel that shame or judgment that they're already sort of imposing on themselves. All right. And the other thing is, just to remember, when we're upset or when we have high affect, when we're worried, when we're really stressed, our memory goes, our processing speed slows down. It's okay if that's happening to you in the moment. If you don't have an answer for a question right away, it's okay. It's okay to say, you know what, I'm not sure about that, but I can find out for you, or we can find out together. Don't feel like you have to have everything resolved in that one conversation. As a matter of fact, it's a really great thing for the goal of your conversation to be to establish a pattern of being able to come back and talk, even if it's a little bit at a time. And the other thing I would say is, whenever a child is struggling with anxiety or depression, we really do consider this to be a family illness. And by that, I don't only mean the possible hereditary part, I mean that the symptoms impact everybody in the family, right? It impacts parents or caregivers in their own relationship. It impacts siblings. So it's really helpful to develop and practice these skills as a family. And it's also really important to think about your own self-care. I know that when I'm worried about my kids, my self-care goes out the window first thing. But that's really not the best thing, because then I'm not at the prime spot of where I should be to be able to manage everything that the kids need. So if you're noticing that your own relationships are in trouble or struggling, or you're feeling isolated, a really important part of treatment for your child is to be able to address those other areas. Based on the statistics that Jim was talking to us about this morning, you are not alone. Even though it might feel really lonely sometimes, you're not alone in experiencing this. There are a lot of other families that are going through this. And developing that sense of community, being able to have resources for yourself, is also very important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dawn, because I know she's going to talk a lot about the community resources that are available for you here. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for having me here today, and to our fellow presenters, such great, important work. So many connections that we'll weave through the presentation I'm going to do. It's a very short presentation, but if we switch gears just for a moment and think about what our schools offer, the work that I've been asked to kind of come in and lead with Carol Kavanaugh, our superintendent, is really, really important, because we don't have all the answers. We have great resources. We have great people that are here to help us, but much of it is driven by this common language, this belief around social emotional competencies, and you're going to see some of what I mean by that in this presentation. So first of all, a little bit about myself. My name is Carla Quaglia Burley, so my middle name's an Italian name, and I usually just shorten it to Burley because people can't pronounce it. And I have spent the last 19 years in education, a good portion of those in Fall River as a principal and school psychologist, and then in Boston Public Schools. And about 5 years there, and then now I'm here with Hopkinton, so I'm really happy to be here. Okay, so this is what we hope for Hopkinton right now, and hopefully I'm not in the way of that slide, but that we are a place where academic learning and meaningful relationships take place, that we are able to establish these partnerships within our schools, with our staffs, with yourselves, your families, and with the community. Our priority as a school in a school district is really around academically, socially, emotionally safety and success for our students, physically as well, and that our educators also have the ability to connect and deepen relationships with students. And this really speaks to all educators, administrators, staff, teachers. And we know right now, especially with what we've gone through the last 2 years with COVID, that social emotional learning is more important now than ever. So we see this in partnership, and another piece of, even with our own children, that we're in partnership. And I say that word with seriousness because partnership requires us to be able to sometimes put ourselves second, to hear what the other person needs and the other person finds important. So to do that, the school, the way we do work, is to understand each other and within that building, understand our families and our caregivers, as well as our community and our partners. And if we do this, we believe it'll help students thrive. So our anchor for this work is this definition, and I'll read it to you, and these 5 competencies. These competencies build the common language. These are things that you can do at home. I would hope you'd reach out to me as a resource if you need any help with information or tools to do this. We're starting to create a website, which you can go on under Hopkinton Public Schools, and I put a monthly newsletter out on a different skill every month, and it gives some home tips for that. So social emotional learning is an integral part of education and human development. It's a process. That means that it's not something we learn and then something we forget about. It's not a content area. It weaves into everything we do. It's part of our intraperson, our interpersonal relationships. It's the way we interact with others within our community. So it's a process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. And many of the skills that the presenters talked about today are rooted in these skills. So when you're talking to your children and you need to kind of self-assess where you're at, you can really ask yourself about some of these skills. Can you recognize your own emotions? Do you know your strengths and values? They're the same skills that we're asking our kids to learn. And sometimes we don't even know what they are. And we're asked to be bringing those to the forefront of having conversations with children. So it's really important just to get to know this wheel. I would love for you to have it in your house. I would love to have the sub-skills posted. I'll get that to you if that's something you'd like. I think it would really be powerful to connect that language from school to home. Right now, being new to the position, over the last 8 months and into September, we're really focusing on getting these competencies out into the classrooms, into the classroom environment, and into the instruction, as well as into the school climate and culture. And to do that, we're integrating 3 signature practices, which includes a welcoming practice, an engaging practice, and an optimistic closure. And that kind of wraps around building a relationship. So when kids come into the classroom, teachers are asked to notice them, right? What is one of the biggest things you hear is, I feel like I'm invisible. A lot of times we hear from students. Teachers notice them, they know something special about them, they start to build that relationship. Through the day or through the instructional period, they make connections with students, which means that there's engaging practices, there's talking, there's movement, there's not just sitting and listening. So there's an opportunity for kids to work with kids, to kids to work with adults. And then the optimistic closure is really to kind of wrap the entire time they've spent together to think about what have I experienced here today and what am I carrying forward. So a lot of times, like especially with young kids, I've found that in the classroom, we often don't talk about what they experienced for the day. And I'm sure when you get them at home, they're like, especially the little kids, they can't even tell you what they did that day. So it's important for us in the schools to help them find that language and help them find that ability to reflect so they then can reflect with you also. And the same, that you teach them how to reflect as well. So we have 4 areas that we're working on this year. School-wide SEL that encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses the way in which our mental health staff is supporting students, our teachers are supporting students, our administrators are supporting students. We're looking at the dynamics of that and exactly, you know, what kids need support, which kids are doing well and thriving. We're looking at the classroom climate, what is the impact of instruction, and how does that look for teachers at different grade levels across different buildings. Academic integration, how are we getting the practices like executive functioning skills, which lean into time management, frontal lobe processing, all the things that kids need for planning. How does that become part of instructional practices? And as well as putting these competencies into, and I think Dr. Kavanaugh put out a memo a couple of weeks ago or last week about where does SEL live in academics? It lives everywhere. It lives in the assignment. It lives in the thinking process. It lives in learning. So we can't escape it. We have to understand it, see it, and be explicit about it. And part of that is helping our adult SEL, which is our educators, understand where their competencies are. So just as you as parents have to think about your own emotions and beliefs and things that you bring forward to your children, the same for adults. We're asking the teachers to do that as well. Know where you're at. Know how we're making connections. And some of that is new thinking for education. But we know with COVID that's a place that we have to go. So one of the things we're doing that's kind of new for Hopkinton is looking at the services that we provide as multiple tiered systems of support. It's been in Massachusetts across the Department of Education for some time now. It's been in education in the colleges and universities for almost 25 years. However, the implementation of this is really hard because you have to go within a system and start to look at how systems operate. So what we know is, and this is very predominant across many school districts, that Tier 1 SEL or Tier 1 systems of supports for students aren't always well defined. Some of the preventive strategies that we have don't always have a high leverage of focus on them, unless some crisis or something occurs. But what we want to do is make sure that we strengthen our Tier 1 because that has to hit all students and be accessible to all students. So whether that's instruction, prevention, behavioral systems, common language, we want to make sure all kids have access to it. Our Tier 2 is where we start to target some of those supports that students need. And that's when we'll start to see that that Tier 1 is not enough. So we need to give a little bit more. And it doesn't mean that's in all things across the board. A student may, students are unique. So you may find a child who is really strong in academics, but has may have anxiety, right? And so what do we want to offer that child to be successful in the school-wide environment? We might offer a Tier 1 strategy or support or intervention. Tier 3 is focused on the highest need of intervention. And the children who often require Tier 3 supports may go into Tier 3 for a little while, come back into Tier 2, but they always get Tier 1. So what that looks like is all students always get Tier 1. If you need a little bit more, you get a little bit more. If you need to be intensive for a little while, you get that as well. This entire system is driven by data. So what that means is that we're monitoring our students for success. So we're looking at continuous improvement. We're looking at things that work, things that don't work. We're looking at subsets of data. So, for example, I know some of our mental health data just came out. We'll be looking at that data to say, what do our students need now? So we might need a prevention strategy or a program for Tier 1 based on that data that we receive. So we have to recalibrate as we learn what is needed from our students. So it's not always business as usual. And so there's some flexibility in that. So our district strategy has been it's pretty big. So we've done a lot of things here. This year, we're moving into where we are, so we've provided some self-supports to the administrators in the schools. We're building that common language, doing the adult SEL stuff. We created cell maps in every school so we know what all the systems of support are that live inside the school, so we know how a child who's struggling flows through the school and what do they get. We created a resource page for educators because educators had a really tough year this year, right? And so we have to support them because they were on that front line with the student every day. And we're also working into wellness, so to understand how PE and health relate to our overall well-being, because as being in the mental health field and also being a counselor, I would say that many of the skills we find is that if someone's struggling, either emotionally or with a diagnosis, one of the strategies is to become physical, move around. When we were in COVID and we were in lockdown, how many of you took walks? I was a regular walker. And so this is very important to understand that physical education and health is also a part of well-being. So I spoke about some of the things we have going on. We're also going to move into restorative practices, which means that we're going to be doing a lot more talking with students and students with students. And that's something that's we're moving into, very excited for next year. We're looking at recalibrating some of our student support work that happens with our counselors in the way in which students are referred. We're doing a lot more professional development and a lot more cross-departmental collaboration. And moving next, for parents and caregivers, those online monthly newsletters are there, but what I'm hoping for and for next year is to really get into some parent workshops. So starting with what is SEL, what are your hopes and dreams, how do you understand those, how can you access those for working with your children, weaving in this idea of gratitude. There's a lot of mindfulness practices that are really helpful for parents, understanding the developmental aspects of your child. So sometimes we see our kids in front of us and they are basically who they are at that moment, but we forget that this too passes. Like sometimes things move on, and that's the development phase, right? When my daughter was in 3rd grade and she was slamming the bedroom door, I was horrified. And I was like, oh my goodness, what am I gonna do? And I remember the pediatrician saying to me, this too will pass. And it did. And she's very strong, and she did a great job in college, and she's really quite a marvel. So, you know, that was a little bump for me as a parent, but we do get through it. So I'm hoping I'll hear from some of you. I'm going to turn this back over to Dawn, and hopefully you'll have some questions for me. So thank you.
So thank you, Jim, Naja, and Carla. I just want to go through your packets with you, and I'm not going to read out all the thanks, but there are several town departments. And if at home you want access to anything that was handed out tonight, it is also on the Youth and Family Services webpage. So if you're watching this at a later date, because this is being recorded, you can go there and find the things that are in the packet we gave out tonight. But several town departments care about you and came together as like a think tank about this evening as well. And we're supportive. And you know, from the select board to the town manager, a big value is being placed on mental health in this community, and I can tell you how thankful I am for that. That I think as a town, Hopkinton gets it, and we're here to support you. And so it's wonderful to see you here tonight as well. I just want to draw your attention that there are nonprofits here tonight. The Freedom Team and the Mental Health Collaborative is here. We have a sign up for mental health first aid from Faith Community Church. Angie Gerard was here earlier. She had to scoot, but she left materials if you want to sign up for mental health first aid and learn more about it. We have a resource table over here from Youth and Family Services and Hopkinton Organizing for Prevention. So, you know, as we go later and you want to mill and pick up more resources, please do. There's information about coming programs. And we will get you that information both on the Youth and Family Services webpage, through our Facebook page, and we'll send it through the schools and in the email hop blasts that come from Hopkinton, the town of Hopkinton. So we'll continue to get you that information. I wanted you to know where you could find it, where you'd receive it. But a big part of your packet tonight is this interface helpline. We contract at Youth and Family Services with the interface helpline. And it's not always clear what interface means, but what it is a referral service that helps you as a parent, you know, when you're busy supporting your loved one, whether it be your spouse, yourself, your kids, your parent, right? And you're looking for an outpatient mental health provider for them. That job has turned into something that can take weeks, months. Sometimes I've heard people tell me years to find the right person. And so Interface was the brainchild of a woman named Margaret, and she has retired, but Nadja is running that program now. And what they did was get trained people on those phones with a huge database of clinicians where somebody could call and say, you know, I have this insurance, I have approximately this availability. My kid is struggling with this, and this, and I'm not really sure what all that means. And they listen, and they try to find the best matches that are available. And so there are no unicorns. We know right now is a really difficult time, and it can take a while to find the right match. But it's so much better with a friend. It's so much better to have support and somebody who's trained, who will then call you and make sure that match has worked out well. And if not, go back to journeying with you through that process. I do consider it like somebody who is like a partner that journeys with you. And during that time, you're there supporting your kid, and you're not repeating over and over and over again what somebody is going through, which can be so demoralizing. So I'm just really proud that this community supports that, that the town has been covering the cost of that, and that you all utilize it. We have a high utilization rate, and I'm really thrilled that people are courageous enough to make that phone call. It's Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. You can leave a message and somebody will call you back, and they start that journey process of finding the right outpatient services for you. On the back of that card, because what if it's like 2 in the morning and you're feeling frustrated and you need somebody to talk to? Interface isn't like there to answer those concerns, but there are psychiatric emergency services on the back of that card, helplines, warm lines that you can call. There's a text line that, you know, I've talked to so many adults that before they're going through something difficult, they might text that line before they walk in the house, you know, and talk to their kid. Like, I'm really struggling with such and such, or I'm struggling with my spouse and I don't want to fight with them, or I need to tell somebody that I'm not doing okay. And they come back and they tell me that that text line has been so helpful because it can be hard to make that call and talk to someone. So we tell kids about that text line a lot. And it helps young people, but it also helps adults too. And, you know, through the rest of those, if you're being hurt by somebody, there's resources for domestic violence on there, Mass 211, they can look up a whole lot of different things for you. And then there's Youth and Family Services in the Senior Center right here in town. You have this. This is how you find us. This is how you reach us. And on the back is Hopkinton Organizing for Prevention, which I'll mention in a little bit. This is information on behavioral health screenings. You don't know where to start. You think you're seeing something in yourself or someone else that you care about. The MindWise behavioral health screenings are a wonderful tool. They're not diagnostic, but they are a wonderful tool, and afterwards you'll receive resources like Interface and things that are local in your community when you take a screen. You can take a general wellness screen, a substance misuse screen. You can take a screen about depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety. There are over 13 screens that you can take. And so utilize that resource. That's something that we contract with through Youth and Family Services for when you're looking to dip your toe in, or you're trying to get more information about stuff you're seeing in yourself or your kid. And you can do those screens as well. On the back of this sheet was sort of our wish list. When we were sitting as a department talking, we thought, what could we put in the hands of all of you right now about what you could do, both on a global scale and down to like a personal scale, to improve youth mental health in Hopkinton? And I would say distribute resources. If you pick up a stack of those interface cards tonight and you leave them, you go into a local business and you say, can I leave them here? You know, whether it's your hairdresser or the liquor store or wherever, you know, like you do your shopping in town, Hop Drug, just ask if there's a place that you can leave those interface cards. Get the word out with us. Link arms with us and spread word about resources. Or if something was helpful about tonight for you, direct somebody to it on HCAM. Take a mental health training program, something deeper, a deeper dive than tonight. In your packet, there's information on QPR, question, persuade, refer. It's clear, concise, and efficient, and it's the 3 steps anyone can learn to prevent suicide. We're offering 3 in-person trainings with the suicide prevention specialist, Sarah Gayer, on May 11th, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, and 1 in the evening. And then we have 2 virtual with Stephanie Schweitzer-Dixon, who is also a suicide prevention specialist. She's doing 2 virtual trainings on May 16th. Then our department, we're doing a Train the Trainer with Sarah Gayer in June. So our department will be able to offer these trainings to the public in small ways, maybe showing up at a committee meeting for one of your committee meetings, or a scout leader meeting, or at a church, or we'll come to you with this late summer. We're going to get a slide deck together, based on the slides of the program, and then other information that you may want to know local to your community, and then we'll be ready to come to you and sort of sit, whether it's a parent coffee and you invite 12 of your friends to talk about these things together and do these trainings. This is one that's important. Help youth to avoid alcohol and other drugs if you can. One way that you can do that is to get involved with Hopkinton Organizing for Prevention. We received the Drug-Free Communities grant. We've got 2 prevention specialists and 1 through another grant through the state. And they're here to help us not only with substance use prevention, but with mental health prevention as well. There's information here about how you can get involved. But the important part about substance use is that the teen brain is still developing, and no amount of substances is good for the teen brain. And I know that folks hold really strongly to different opinions about that, but what we know is that as the brain is developing, it can habituate to those substances and increase the likelihood of addiction. And it actually masks when kids are going through something really tough, and it masks the symptoms and can create bigger issues for them down the road. So another thing is to limit youth intake of social media and screen time. And you're like, oh, please, like, if I could do that. But get creative, incentivize it. One of the things I love to do is like, I bet you can't. And then they're like, what? Like, well, I will bet you a $25 gift card that you can't go 3 days without such and such, or whatever. And we do this with kids in our office. Like, we will incentivize them with like a $10 gift card to somewhere. And can you do a challenge to stay away from your social media? Take the apps off your phone for a week. And like, we'll help them with some of that process, right? We do it with the groups that we're with. They will always come back to us and like, I felt like I could breathe that week. Like, it was hard the first couple of days and I hated you. But, but after that, like, I felt like I could breathe. Like, I didn't worry that I was missing out on things. And I think if you can get creative with them and make it worth their while, like money talks, or maybe something else they're really looking forward to, right? To limit that social media intake, to give them a chance to get away from it, even for a short time, builds perspective. And for us too, model it. As Nadja was saying, put the phones down. It's important. Get youth and yourself outside as often as you can. I heard that mentioned about, I think Carla mentioned that, about being outdoors, so you can read that through. And then promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I mean, one of the biggest things are the kids who are diverse, right? And it's not just the LGBTQ plus population, they're in there, but it's kids of color in this community, it's kids with disabilities, and we know that they have higher rates of depression, and they report higher rates of bullying, and they're struggling. And so with the Freedom Team here, check out their website. They have some great ideas about how you can get involved to promote equity in the community and make it a safer place for kids in the community where they know they belong. When a youth shares with you about who they are, believe them. This is a hard one for me too. But I've come to a place that whether it's about their identity, a concern or a worry, a hope or a dream, or some of their favorite things, it's all important. If you struggle with what you're hearing, it's okay to pause and just take it in. You heard that earlier. And you know, like, just put the pause button on. We don't have to be talking like when they're telling us all this stuff. But believe them. And a good follow-up question is, how can I best support you? Or if they're one like, I don't need your support, I'm good, what do you think? You know, like I get that sometimes. You know, what does support look like to you right now? You know, and then just letting it sit for a while. You can come back to a topic at any time. And you can say, you know, I've been thinking about you and holding you in my heart, and you mentioned something to me the other day, and I'm wondering if now's a good time. Just getting some distance from it to talk about it. Establish a support network. We heard about that, so I won't process that again with you, but there's information in there about how to do that. And then lastly, reduce stigma. Treat mental health as health. Seek care for mental health as you would any other medical need. You know, if you're in pain, you know, somewhere in your body, hopefully you're not blowing it off, right? You know, hopefully you're following up with that. If you're in emotional pain, you know, follow up and model that. And be open. If you are receiving support or help, be open with your kids, you know? You know, there was a mom who used to go to her counseling appointment, and she'd have a babysitter come in every week, and she never told the kids where she was going. And one day she thought, like, you know, her counselor kind of encouraged her, maybe you should tell the kids where you go. And when she sat down with them, they always are imagining something so different. And the kids, one thought she was pregnant, one thought she had cancer, you know, but when she was able to sit with them and talk about, like, oh, I'm getting some help with my feelings. You know, she didn't have to go deep dive into her stuff, but she was able to model for them that she needed help and support too. We all do. So that's what I got. I hope you guys have been writing some questions down and passing them over. We can answer some of those questions, you know, via the cards, or we can just cut this off now and you can ask questions without the cameras. So show of hands. Would you rather us cut the cameras, or would you rather pass cards in? So cut the cameras. All right, we're cutting the cameras because there's enough folks. So we're going to say goodnight. If you have questions that you want answers to, reach out to Youth and Family Services. If we don't have the answer, we'll find it for you. Take care.